Impeachable or not? That's the question plaguing the president today. NBC News reports the president has told multiple people close to him in recent days that he is alarmed by the prospect of impeachment despite publicly stating otherwise. And now he awaits the testimony of longtime friend, head of the National Enquirer, whose parent company, American Media Inc., acknowledged paying hush money to Karen McDougal, who alleged an affair with Donald Trump to, quote, suppress the woman's story and prevent it from influencing the election, known as Catch and Kill. This comes as federal prosecutors announced Wednesday they would not prosecute the company for its role in a scheme to tilt the presidential race in Trump's favor. In the agreement, AMI said it would cooperate with prosecutors and admitted it paid $150,000 to Karen McDougal before the 2016 election to silence her allegations of an affair with Trump, allegations his aides have denied. The deal signaled the unraveling of the deep relationship Trump and AMI's chief executive had forged over decades. The deal also made clear that Pecker, whose tabloid strongly supported Trump's candidacy, has turned on the president. AMI's cooperation with the Southern District of New York became public Wednesday as Michael Cohen, Mr. Trump's longtime fixer, was sentenced for campaign finance violations for his role in arranging payments to McDougal and Stormy Daniels, the porn film star who also alleges an affair with Mr. Trump, which he denies. But the deal dates back to September. Now, additional pressure mounts on the president as he faces multiple investigations and finds himself concerned he could lose the protection of some of his long-standing allies. So let's dig deeper into who David Pecker is and the role AMI played here. David Pecker was the chairman, president, and CEO of American Media Inc., a powerful media organization that publishes the National Enquirer, Muscle and Fitness, Star, among others. In a 2014 interview with the Native Society, an exclusive club for New York's elite power brokers, Pecker described Trump as a close friend that he admired. A year later, Pecker met with Michael Cohen, which Pecker floated the idea of buying the silence of women who came forward with allegations about Mr. Trump. Now, the New York Times reported that Pecker even visited the White House as early as July 2017 to dine with the president. So it isn't exactly shocking that Pecker allegedly directed the National Enquirer to catch and kill a damaging story about Mr. Trump before the 2016 election. Catch and kill, we've been talking about it. It means trapping a story to keep it out of the public eye for one reason or another. And in this case, locking it in a safe. Literally, according to the Associated Press, the National Enquirer kept a safe containing documents on those hush money payments and other damaging stories as part of its relationship with Mr. Trump. That revelation came after several media outlets reported that federal prosecutors granted Pecker immunity. 5 people familiar with American Media Inc., who spoke to the AP on the condition of anonymity because of non-disclosure agreements, said the safe was a great source of power for Pecker. The president spoke moments ago on Fox News about Cohen's sentencing. This is breaking news, folks. Let's listen in.
They put that on to embarrass me. They put those 2 charges on to embarrass me. They're not criminal charges. What happened is either Cohen or the prosecutors, in order to embarrass me, said, listen, I'm making this deal for reduced time and everything else. Do me a favor, put these 2 charges on.
Joining me live, NBC News investigations reporter Tom Winter, NBC reporter Carol Lee, and NBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner. Thanks to all of you for being here. Glenn, I want to start with you. Respond to what we just heard from President Trump about Cohen's sentencing yesterday.
Well, you know, he can claim that prosecutors did this to embarrass him, but I didn't hear him claim that the judge in the Southern District of New York, who not only accepted this plea as being sort of factually supported by the evidence, and then who himself announced that he credits this evidence, that maybe the judge is trying to embarrass the president as well. But, you know, I think what we have here, Kristen, is we're focused on what we now, I think, can say confidently are 2 felonies that the president committed together with Michael Cohen. But, you know, I think we're forgetting that those aren't the only 2 crimes that arise out of this transaction. He also is guilty, in my opinion, as a former 30-year prosecutor, of a conspiracy over and above those 2 campaign finance violations, because he committed these crimes with others, with Pecker, it looks like, potentially, with Alan Weisselberg, and certainly with Michael Cohen. A conspiracy to commit those crimes is another crime in and of itself.
Conventional wisdom is you can't indict a sitting president. Adam Schiff has said, hey, wait a minute, we might need to challenge that. Does he have any leg to stand on there?
I don't. I think there's a split in the conventional wisdom, and I've heard law professor Lawrence Tribe and former acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal both offer opinions that you can indict a sitting president. I happen to believe in the rationale that those two men set out. But let's be clear. If the president went out and, as he famously said, killed someone on Fifth Avenue, he would be arrested, he would be charged, and he would be tried, even if he was a sitting president. If you agree with that proposition, everything else is just a matter of degree.
Carol, there's the legal jeopardy and the political jeopardy for President Trump. And you and I have been working our sources throughout the night talking about that aspect of it. Publicly, the president says he's not concerned about impeachment. He says the people would revolt if he were impeached. But our sources are saying something different.
Yeah, the people that we talked to have said that the president is, reaching out to friends, to allies he feels like he has on Capitol Hill, and venting about the situation he feels that he's in, the pressure he's under, and also, asking questions about impeachment and, complaining why nobody's doing anything to help him out of this. And in the process of that, expressing concern that this is something that could gain traction. And part of the issue for the president and the people around him is that they don't know what else is coming. And we've seen that just in the last week. We saw first the Cohen piece, and now we've seen the AMI piece, and they don't know what else is happening. And so in our reporting, we learned that one of the things that the president's allies feel is he really needs to hold on to those establishment Republicans, the people that he ran against in 2016 in the primary, the system that he tried to buck, and that now, as it turns out, he might need those people to hold off any, traction that impeachment could gain.
And Tom, pick up on Carol's point about what might happen next. We know that Michael Cohen is still cooperating with federal investigators. The president tweeting, not only is he talking about Michael Cohen, he tweeted about him earlier today. He said, I never directed Michael Cohen to break the law. He was a lawyer and he is supposed to know the law. It is called advice of counsel. He goes on to take more aim at him. The fact that Michael Cohen is still cooperating, how significant is that for President Trump moving forward?
Well, I think there's two kind of forks in the road here, Kristen. One, still cooperating with respect to the special counsel's office and their kind of core mission, and they keep repeating that he has been helpful to their core mission, which is to look into Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 election and whether or not that was coordinated with President Trump. I think there's probably a significant risk for the president if, in fact, he is giving them truthful and honest information. They say that he has, and depending upon what the specifics of that information are, we don't yet know that. That could be a significant concern for the president. With respect to what we've been talking about here with AMI, with David Pecker, with these payments to women who allege affairs with the president, the Southern District has made it pretty clear here that Michael Cohen has not cooperated in the fullest sense of what they would define as a normal cooperation. So I think it remains to be seen whether Michael Cohen will speak with prosecutors here in New York, what he may give them going forward now that he's been sentenced, and whether or not he wants to more fully cooperate with them. That's kind of a little bit more of a tricky legal thing that we could spend a lot of time on, but I think that raises some interesting questions. Frankly, Kristen, they may not need him. Is this non-prosecution agreement and the statement of facts associated with it yesterday make it clear that there was a lot of cooperation by AMI and apparently by David Pecker here to say what those meetings were about and the purpose of those payments. I think that's pretty damning to the president on its own.
Well, Glenn, how significant could David Pecker's cooperation be, that stunner that we learned about yesterday?
Well, it sounds like they came right out and said that, Pecker and AMI basically did what they did, caught and killed stories embarrassing to Trump for Trump's political advantage and in coordination with the campaign. Given that Pecker has immunity, he can now openly and fully tell the prosecutors, tell the special counsel what he knows about Trump and the Trump organization with no fear of any reprisals unless he lies. That's a powerful incentive to be fully forthcoming.
Carol, as we continue to look forward, I want to play something that two Republican senators said a few days ago and get your reaction on the other side.
Am I concerned that the president might be involved in a crime? Of course. The question is then whether or not this so-called hush money is a crime. John Edwards obviously was prosecuted for the same thing, and Justice Department failed.
If someone has violated the law, the application of the law should be applied to them like it would to any other citizen in this country. And obviously, if you're in a position of great authority like the presidency, that would be the case. My decision on that, or my position on that, will not be a political decision. It'll be the fact that we are a nation of laws, and no one in this country, no matter who you are, is above it.
Carol, you talked about the significance of establishment Republicans. Are those the type of people the White House, the president, are going to be watching very closely?
They're exactly the type of people they're going to be watching very closely. And, you know, particularly as our reporting showed, Rubio's remarks spooked some people around the president, and they were concerned about that. Look, they're looking for any hint that the establishment or any Republicans are going to break from the president on this issue, because they've been, a vast majority, even now still, have been very solidly supportive and very tenuous in their comments about whether or not they think what's the legal fallout that the president faces is significant. So they're on very close watch for people like Marco Rubio, for sure.
Right. We'll all be tracking it closely.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.